The morning sun cast long shadows across the military checkpoint as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes one final time. After 18 months deployed in classified operations across 3 continents, she was finally heading home. The weight of her duffel bag felt insignificant compared to the emotional baggage she carried from her latest mission. Her team had successfully dismantled a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on American soil, but the cost had been higher than anyone anticipated. Sarah stood in line with dozens of other travelers, military personnel, and contractors waiting to pass through the security checkpoint at Air Base in Germany. Her short auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore faded jeans and a plain gray sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was one of the most decorated special operations commanders in the United States military. She preferred it that way. The line moved slowly, typical for international departures. Sarah found herself lost in thought, replaying the debriefing sessions from the past week. Her commanding officer had recommended her for another commendation, but all she wanted was to see her younger brother Tommy graduate from college next week. She had missed too many important moments in the lives of people she cared about. Behind her in line, she could hear a man talking loudly on his phone, his voice carrying an air of self-importance that made several people turn around. "Look, I don't care what the delay is. I have a board meeting in New York tomorrow, and these military people need to understand that some of us have real jobs with real responsibilities." Sarah glanced back briefly and saw a tall man in an expensive suit, probably in his early 40s, with perfectly styled hair and a watch that cost more than most people made in 6 months. He was gesturing dramatically while speaking into a gold-plated phone, completely oblivious to the annoyed looks from the soldiers and their families around him. "These people chose this life," the man continued into his phone, his voice growing louder. "The least they can do is run an efficient operation. I mean, how hard can it be to check some IDs and wave people through?" A young soldier with a Purple Heart pinned to his dress uniform shifted uncomfortably ahead of them. Sarah noticed the soldier's wife gently squeeze his hand, and she could see the tension in both their faces. The soldier had clearly been through hell, and the last thing he needed was some corporate executive diminishing his service. The line crept forward, and Sarah watched as families reunited with their returning loved ones just beyond the checkpoint. A little girl ran into the arms of her father, a sergeant who had been deployed for 8 months. The pure joy on both their faces reminded Sarah why she did what she did, why she spent months away from everything familiar, operating in dangerous territories where one wrong move could mean death. "Sir, if you could please keep your voice down," one of the security personnel politely requested as the man's conversation grew even more disruptive. The man in the suit looked offended. "Excuse me, I'm having a private conversation about legitimate business matters. Maybe if this place was run more professionally, people wouldn't be so stressed." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had spent the last year and a half working alongside some of the most professional, dedicated, and skilled individuals she had ever known. Men and women who put their lives on the line every single day, who made incredible sacrifices for people who would never even know their names. To hear someone dismiss their service so casually struck a nerve she didn't realize was so exposed. The line moved forward again, and they were now just a few people away from the checkpoint. Sarah could see the security officer checking documents, his movements precise and thorough. These weren't just bureaucratic procedures. They were essential security measures designed to keep everyone safe, measures that people like her had helped develop based on real-world threats and hard-earned intelligence. "This is ridiculous," the man behind her announced to anyone within earshot. "I'm going to miss my connection because of this incompetence. Don't these people understand that the real world doesn't stop just because they want to play soldier?" That was the last straw for several people in line. Sarah saw the young Purple Heart recipient's hands clench into fists, and she knew she needed to intervene before the situation escalated. She was about to turn around when she felt a sharp push against her shoulder. The man in the suit had decided he had waited long enough. Without any warning or apology, he shoved past Sarah, nearly knocking her off balance, and pushed ahead toward the checkpoint. "Excuse me, I need to get through here. Some of us have real jobs to get back to." Sarah stumbled slightly but quickly regained her footing. The audacity of his actions left her momentarily speechless. Around her, she could hear other people expressing their shock and anger at what they had just witnessed. Hey, you can't just cut in line like that, someone called out. The man didn't even turn around. I have priority status, and I'm not waiting in line with a bunch of weekend warriors and government contractors. The security officer at the checkpoint looked up at the commotion. Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your place in line. Everyone needs to wait their turn. Do you know who I am? The man demanded, his voice rising to an almost theatrical level. I'm Richard, Senior Vice President of Industries. We have contracts worth hundreds of millions with the Department of Defense. I think I've earned the right to not stand in line with these people. Sarah watched as pulled out his wallet and began waving what appeared to be some kind of VIP pass. She had seen his type before, corporate executives who thought their government contracts gave them special privileges, who believed their financial contributions to the military-industrial complex somehow made them more important than the people who actually served. I appreciate your business with the Department of Defense, sir, but everyone goes through the same security procedures, the officer explained patiently. I'm going to need you to return to your place in line. His face turned red with indignation. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that makes America less competitive in the global marketplace. You people have no idea how the real world works. Sarah had heard enough. She stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. Actually, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Turned around, seeing Sarah for the first time since he had pushed past her. His eyes quickly assessed her civilian clothes and unassuming appearance, and his expression shifted to one of dismissive condescension. Look, lady, I don't know what your deal is, but this doesn't concern you. Go back to waiting in line like a good little government employee. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the eyes of everyone in the immediate area focusing on this confrontation. She could have simply let it go, could have allowed to make his scene and eventually get processed through security. But something about his complete disrespect for everyone around him, his casual dismissal of people who had sacrificed so much, made her decide that perhaps it was time for a small lesson in humility. You're absolutely right that I work for the government, Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level. But I think you might be surprised by what that actually means. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her identification, not the civilian passport she had been planning to use, but her military credentials. The security officer's eyes widened as he saw her rank and clearance level. Captain Sarah Martinez, United States Army Special Operations Command, she said clearly, making sure her voice carried to the people around them. And you're right, mister, I do work for the government. Specifically, I command a Tier 1 Special Operations team responsible for counterterrorism operations in classified theaters of operation. The checkpoint area had grown noticeably quieter. His confident expression began to falter as he processed what he had just heard, but his arrogance was too deeply ingrained for him to back down immediately. Well, that's very nice for you, Captain, but I still have legitimate business to conduct, and I don't appreciate being lectured by someone who probably makes less in a year than I spend on suits. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his point. You know what, mister, you're probably right about the salary difference. I'm sure you do very well for yourself. But I'm curious about something. You mentioned that you have contracts with the Department of Defense worth hundreds of millions. What kind of work does Industries do exactly? Straightened his tie, clearly pleased to have an opportunity to showcase his importance. We provide logistical support and security consultation for military operations overseas. My company has been instrumental in supporting American forces in multiple theaters of operation. That's fascinating, Sarah said, genuine interest in her voice. So you're involved in supporting the kind of operations that people like me conduct in the field. Exactly. Without companies like mine, the military couldn't function effectively in today's complex global environment. Sarah smiled, but there was something in her expression that made several people in line take a step back. Well then, mister, I'm sure you'll be very interested to know that I just spent the last 18 months working in operations that were probably supported, at least in part, by your company's logistics network. Seemed pleased by this connection. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. People like me make it possible for people like you to do your jobs. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. And I want you to know that I have nothing but respect for the civilian contractors who put themselves at risk to support military operations. I've worked alongside logistics coordinators and security consultants who showed incredible bravery and professionalism under extremely dangerous conditions. Nodded, his chest puffing up with pride. However, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, I've also encountered a different type of contractor. The kind who stays safely behind the wire, who profits from military operations without ever really understanding what's at stake, who thinks their financial contribution gives them the right to disrespect the people who actually do the fighting and dying. The checkpoint area had grown completely silent now. Even the security personnel had paused their work to listen to this exchange. Now, I don't know which type of contractor you are, mister, Sarah said, taking a step closer to him. But based on your behavior here today, based on your casual dismissal of military personnel and your apparent belief that your business dealings make you more important than a Purple Heart recipient. She gestured toward the young soldier who was still standing in line, watching the exchange with wide eyes. I'm starting to form an opinion. His face had gone pale. For the first time since Sarah had been observing him, he seemed to be at a loss for words. But hey, Sarah continued, her voice returning to its earlier conversational tone. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're one of the good ones. Maybe you've actually spent time in forward operating bases. Maybe you've been under fire. Maybe you understand what it's like to wonder if you're going to see your family again. She paused, studying his face carefully. Have you, mister? Have you ever been in actual danger while supporting these military operations that make your company so much money? The silence stretched on for several long seconds, finally cleared his throat. Well, I mean my role is more strategic. I coordinate things from a management level. Ah, Sarah said, nodding as if this explained everything. Management level, behind the wire, safe and sound while other people take the risks. The young soldier with the Purple Heart had moved closer, along with several other military personnel who had been in line. Sarah could see a mix of anger and satisfaction on their faces as they watched squirm under her questioning. Look, I don't see what this has to do with anything, said, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. I just want to get through security and catch my flight. Of course you do, Sarah said sympathetically. And you know what? You're absolutely going to get through security and catch your flight, right after you do two very simple things. Looked at her warily. What things? First, Sarah said, holding up one finger, you're going to apologize to every single person in this line that you pushed past and disrespected with your comments about their service. And second, asked, though he looked like he was afraid to hear the answer. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. Second, you're going to go to the back of the line and wait your turn like everyone else. Because despite what you might think, mister, your money doesn't make you more important than these people. Your contracts don't give you the right to push past a woman whose husband died serving this country, or a soldier who took shrapnel to protect people he'd never met, or anyone else who chose to serve something bigger than themselves. The area around the checkpoint had grown even more crowded as word of the confrontation spread. Sarah could see other military personnel and their families gathering to watch, along with civilian travelers who seemed invested in seeing how this would play out. Looked around at all the faces staring at him, many of them clearly hostile. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and rapidly running out of options. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but his voice lacked any of its earlier conviction. You can't just humiliate someone like this in public. You're right, Sarah agreed. I can't humiliate you in public. Only you can do that. I'm just giving you the opportunity to show everyone here what kind of person you really are. She gestured toward the people around them. You have a choice, mister. You can apologize, go to the back of the line, and salvage what's left of your dignity. Or you can continue to demonstrate to everyone here that you're exactly the kind of person who thinks money and contracts make him better than people who serve their country. Stood there for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Sarah could see him calculating, trying to figure out if there was some way he could save face while still getting what he wanted. Finally, he seemed to realize that he was completely trapped. The crowd around him was growing larger and more hostile with each passing second, and there was no way he was getting through that checkpoint without dealing with Sarah first. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I apologize for my comments. I was stressed about my flight and I spoke inappropriately. The apology was grudging and clearly insincere, but Sarah nodded as if it were perfectly acceptable. That's a good start, mister. Now, I believe there are several specific people you need to apologize to." She gestured toward the young soldier with the purple heart. "That young man there, for instance. You suggested that he and others like him aren't real professionals. I think he deserves a personal apology." Jaw worked silently for several seconds before he walked over to the soldier. "I apologize for my comments," he said stiffly. "They were inappropriate and disrespectful." The soldier nodded but didn't say anything. His wife, however, stepped forward. "My husband lost 3 friends in Afghanistan," she said quietly. "He spent 2 months in a military hospital after an IED explosion. Maybe next time you'll think before you dismiss someone's service." His face flushed red, but he nodded and moved on to apologize to several other people he had offended with his comments. Each apology was painful for him, and Sarah could see that he was struggling with the public nature of his humiliation. When he had finished his apologies, he looked back at Sarah with undisguised resentment. "Are we done here?" "Almost," Sarah said cheerfully. "There's just one more thing. The back of the line is over there." She pointed toward the end of the queue, which had grown significantly longer during their confrontation. Looked at the line, then back at Sarah, then at the crowd of people watching him. "You've got to be kidding me." "Not at all," Sarah said. "Everyone waits their turn. That's how civilized society works." For a moment, it looked like might refuse. Sarah could see him calculating whether he could somehow force his way through the checkpoint anyway, or whether he could appeal to the security personnel to intervene on his behalf. But then he looked around at all the faces staring at him, many of them belonging to people who had clearly served in combat, and he seemed to realize that he was completely outnumbered and, with obvious reluctance, he picked up his expensive luggage and began walking toward the back of the line. As he passed Sarah, he leaned in close and whispered, "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Actually, mister, I think you're the one who has no idea who you're messing with, but don't worry, you're about to find out." The confrontation at the checkpoint had drawn quite a crowd, and Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her as Richard grudgingly made his way to the back of the line. She had hoped that would be the end of it, that she could simply process through security and catch her flight home in peace. But something about his parting threat nagged at her. In her line of work, threats weren't taken lightly, especially when they came from someone who claimed to have significant defense contracts. As Sarah approached the security checkpoint, the officer who had witnessed the entire exchange looked at her with obvious respect. "Captain Martinez, that was impressive. We get contractors like him through here all the time, and most people just put up with their attitude." Sarah handed over her credentials. Sometimes people need to be reminded that rank and respect are earned, not bought. The security officer processed her paperwork quickly and efficiently. "I hope you don't mind me saying, ma'am, but that guy seemed pretty angry when he walked away. You might want to be careful." "I appreciate the concern," Sarah replied, collecting her documents. "But I've dealt with worse threats than an angry businessman." What Sarah didn't mention was that threat had actually piqued her professional interest. In her experience, legitimate defense contractors didn't usually respond to public embarrassment with barely veiled threats. They might be angry, they might complain to their contacts in the Pentagon, but they typically didn't suggest that someone had no idea who they're messing with. That kind of language usually came from people who had something to hide. As she made her way through the terminal toward her gate, Sarah found herself thinking about Industries. The name was vaguely familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. In her line of work, she dealt with dozens of different contractors and logistics companies, and it was impossible to keep track of all of them. But something about the company name was tickling the back of her memory, and not in a good way. She settled into a seat near her gate and pulled out her encrypted phone. Technically, she was on leave, and technically, she shouldn't be conducting any kind of official investigation. But after 3 years in special operations, Sarah had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that Richard was more than just an arrogant businessman. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Lieutenant Colonel David, her intelligence liaison at Special Operations Command. Was one of the most thorough analysts she had ever worked with, and if there was anything questionable about Industries, he would be able to find it. "Sarah's voice came through clearly despite the encrypted connection. "Please tell me you're calling to say you've decided to extend your leave. You've earned it." "Actually, Dave, I need a favor. Can you run a background check on a company called Industries and its senior VP, Richard?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. You've been on leave for exactly 6 hours and you're already investigating someone. What happened? Sarah gave a brief rundown of the incident at the checkpoint, focusing on his behavior and his final threat. As she spoke, she could hear typing in the background, already beginning his search. Interesting, said when she finished. Industries does have significant defense contracts. They've been providing logistics support in multiple theaters for the past 5 years. On the surface, they look legitimate. On the surface? Well, that's just it. Their background is almost too clean. Major defense contractor, millions in government contracts, but very little public footprint. Most companies that size have extensive media coverage, trade publications, industry conferences. Industries is almost invisible outside of their government work. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. In the world of special operations, companies that tried to stay invisible usually had good reasons for doing so. Can you dig deeper? She asked. Already am, replied. Give me a few hours, I'll call you back with whatever I can find. Sarah hung up and sat back in her chair, watching the other passengers boarding flights to destinations around the world. She tried to tell herself that she was probably overreacting. That was likely just another arrogant businessman who didn't like being publicly embarrassed. But her instincts had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations, and those same instincts were telling her that there was more to this story. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her brother Tommy. Can't wait to see you at graduation. It's been too long, sis. Sarah smiled, remembering why she was on this flight in the first place. Tommy was graduating summa cum from Georgetown with a degree in international relations, and he had been accepted to law school at. She was incredibly proud of him, and she was determined not to let her paranoia about Richard ruin this family moment. Her flight was called, and Sarah boarded the aircraft, settling into her seat for the long flight back to the United States. She tried to read, tried to watch a movie, tried to do anything to distract herself from thinking about industries. But every time she closed her eyes, she found herself replaying the conversation at the checkpoint, analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression. About halfway through the flight, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from, "Call me as soon as you land. What you stumbled onto is bigger than either of us thought." Sarah stared at the message, her heart racing. In 3 years of working with, she had never seen him use that tone in a text message. Whatever he had found, it was serious enough to make a veteran intelligence analyst concerned. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Sarah found herself going through various scenarios in her head, trying to figure out what might have discovered about industries. Were they involved in illegal arms trafficking? Were they selling information to foreign governments? Were they embezzling money from defense contracts? All of these possibilities seemed more likely than the alternative, which was that she had simply encountered an arrogant businessman and was now paranoid for no reason. When the plane finally landed at Dulles International Airport, Sarah was one of the first passengers off. She made her way through customs and immigration as quickly as possible, then found a quiet corner of the terminal and called. "Jesus, Sarah," said without preamble, "where did you meet this guy?" "At a checkpoint in Germany. Dave, what did you find?" Industries is definitely a legitimate defense contractor, but their funding sources are questionable. About 60% of their capital came from a shell company based in the islands, and that shell company has ties to at least 3 different organizations that are currently under investigation by the Treasury Department for money laundering. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Money laundering for who? That's where it gets really interesting. The shell company has connections to several Eastern European arms dealers, a Pakistani intelligence front company, and at least 2 organizations that we suspect of funding terrorist activities in Southeast Asia. "Holy shit," Sarah whispered. "It gets worse," continued. "I did some digging into Richard's personal background. The guy doesn't exist." "What do you mean he doesn't exist?" "I mean Richard, senior vice president of industries, has no background prior to 5 years ago. No college records, no previous employment, no military service, nothing. It's like he just materialized out of thin air when the company was founded." Sarah's mind was racing. In her experience, people who had completely fabricated identities were usually involved in something much more serious than simple business fraud. "Dave, I need you to send me everything you have on industries and Richard. I also need you to flag this for the counterintelligence people. If this company is involved in money laundering for terrorist organizations, and they have access to sensitive military logistics information. Already done, interrupted. I've sent a preliminary report to CI and they're opening an investigation. But Sarah, I need to ask you something. This guy threatened you directly, right? It was pretty vague, but yeah, he made it clear that he didn't appreciate being embarrassed. Well, here's the thing. Based on what I've found, Richard isn't just some businessman who got his feelings hurt. If he's involved with the kind of people I think he's involved with, then he might actually be dangerous. You need to be careful. Sarah appreciated concern, but she had spent the last 3 years dealing with people who were definitely dangerous, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by a suspected money launderer in an expensive suit. I can take care of myself, Dave, but I want to know more about this company. If they're using defense contracts to funnel money to terrorist organizations, then we need to shut them down. Agreed, I'm going to keep digging and I'll coordinate with the counterintelligence investigation. But Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. Don't try to handle this on your own. I promise, Sarah said, though she had no intention of sitting on the sidelines while a potential terrorist financier operated freely. After hanging up with, Sarah made her way to the rental car counter, her mind spinning with possibilities. She had originally planned to drive straight to Georgetown to surprise Tommy before his graduation ceremony, but now she found herself wondering if she should make a detour. If Industries was based somewhere in the D.C. area, it might be worth taking a look at their operations. As she waited in line at the rental counter, Sarah became aware that someone was watching her. It was a subtle feeling, the kind of awareness that had kept her alive in hostile territories, but unmistakable once she noticed it. She casually glanced around the busy terminal, trying to identify the source of her unease. There, about 50 feet away, stood a man in a dark suit reading a newspaper. He was tall, athletic-looking, and wearing sunglasses indoors. Under normal circumstances, that might not have been particularly suspicious in an airport, but Sarah noticed that he had been holding the same page of the newspaper for the entire time she had been watching him, and his body position suggested that his attention was focused on her rather than on what he was reading. Sarah turned back toward the rental counter, her pulse quickening. It was possible that the man was just another traveler who happened to be looking in her direction, but in her line of work, coincidences were rare and usually dangerous. When she reached the front of the line, Sarah quickly rented a car and made her way toward the exit, keeping track of the man in the dark suit through her peripheral vision. He folded his newspaper and began following her, maintaining a distance that would have been perfect for surveillance. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Instead of heading directly to the parking garage, she took a circuitous route through the terminal, stopping at various shops and restaurants, doubling back on herself, and using reflective surfaces to monitor her tail. The man in the dark suit stayed with her through every maneuver, confirming her suspicions that she was being followed. As she approached the parking garage, Sarah made a decision. If someone was already surveilling her less than 2 hours after she had confronted Richard, then this situation was much more serious than she had initially thought. She needed to find out who was following her and why. The parking garage was dimly lit and relatively empty, perfect for what Sarah had in mind. She made her way to her rental car, a nondescript sedan on the 3rd level, and pretended to fumble with her keys while keeping track of her follower's position. The man in the dark suit had positioned himself behind a concrete pillar about 30 feet away, clearly trying to maintain visual contact while staying hidden. Sarah dropped her keys, and as she bent to pick them up, she palmed a small tactical knife that she always carried, even when traveling in civilian clothes. When she straightened up, she turned and walked directly toward the man in the dark suit. "Excuse me," she called out in a friendly voice. "I think I'm lost. Could you help me find the exit?" The man looked startled by her direct approach. Up close, Sarah could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of build and bearing that suggested military or law enforcement background. But there was something in his eyes that didn't quite fit with legitimate security work. "I'm sorry, lady, I don't work here," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. "That's okay," Sarah replied, stepping closer. "Maybe you could just point me in the right direction." As she spoke, she shifted her weight slightly, positioning herself for a quick takedown if necessary. The man seemed to sense that something had changed in the dynamic between them, and his hand moved instinctively toward what was probably a concealed weapon. That was all the confirmation Sarah needed. Legitimate airport security or law enforcement wouldn't be carrying concealed weapons while conducting surveillance, and they certainly wouldn't be nervous about helping a lost traveler find her way. Actually, Sarah said, her voice taking on a completely different tone, I think you're exactly the person I need to talk to. Before the man could react, Sarah moved. Her training in close-quarters combat was extensive, and she had the advantage of surprise. In one fluid motion, she stepped inside his reach, grabbed his wrist, and applied a joint lock that brought him to his knees while simultaneously disarming him. The weapon that clattered to the concrete floor was a 19 with the serial numbers filed off. Definitely not standard issue for any legitimate security organization. Now then, Sarah said, maintaining her grip on the man's wrist while keeping her voice calm and conversational. Why don't you tell me who sent you to follow me, and we can avoid making this any more unpleasant than it needs to be? The man's face was contorted with pain, but he glared at her defiantly. I don't know what you're talking about, lady. You just assaulted an innocent person. Sarah increased the pressure on the joint lock slightly, and the man gasped. I don't think innocent people usually carry untraceable handguns in airport parking garages. Let's try again. Who sent you? For several long seconds, the man remained silent. Then Sarah heard the sound of car doors slamming somewhere else in the parking garage, followed by footsteps moving in their direction. Looks like your friends are coming to help, Sarah observed. This is your last chance to make this easy on yourself. Who are you working for? The man's eyes darted toward the sound of the approaching footsteps, and Sarah could see him calculating his options. Finally, he seemed to realize that his situation was hopeless. He whispered, Richard hired us to keep an eye on you. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. Her instincts had been correct, was much more than just an arrogant businessman, and he had moved remarkably quickly to put surveillance on her. How many of you are there? She asked. 3, the man replied, but they'll be here any second and you can't take all of us. Sarah smiled grimly. Want to bet? The sound of footsteps echoing through the parking garage was getting closer, and Sarah knew she had only seconds to decide her next move. She could hear at least 2 sets of feet moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested professional training. These weren't amateur thugs that had hired off the street. These were experienced operatives, which made the situation much more dangerous and much more interesting. Sarah quickly assessed her tactical situation. She was in a concrete parking garage with limited cover, facing at least 2 unknown hostiles who were probably armed and definitely coordinated. Under normal circumstances, the smart move would be to call for backup and wait for law enforcement. But these weren't normal circumstances. If had been able to put surveillance on her within hours of their confrontation, and if he had access to the kind of professional operatives she was dealing with, then he was connected to something much larger and more dangerous than simple money laundering. Listen carefully, Sarah whispered to the man she was restraining. I'm going to let you go, and you're going to walk away from here and forget you ever saw me. If you or your friends try to follow me again, things are going to get very unpleasant very quickly. The man nodded frantically, clearly eager to escape the painful joint lock she had him in. Sarah released him and stepped back, but she kept his weapon and positioned herself behind a concrete pillar where she would have cover when his partners arrived. The man scrambled to his feet, rubbing his wrist, and looked toward the sound of the approaching footsteps. They're not going to just let you walk away, he said. Wants to know what you know about his operation. Then is going to be disappointed, Sarah replied. Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you go. The man hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. Instead of walking away as Sarah had hoped, he called out to his approaching partners. She's over here, behind the pillar, she's armed. Sarah sighed. She had really hoped to avoid violence in a public place, but it seemed like these operatives were determined to do this the hard way. The footsteps immediately changed direction, moving faster now and with obvious tactical purpose. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of weapons being drawn, followed by hand signals being exchanged in what sounded like Russian or another Eastern European language. That was interesting information, was apparently working with foreign operatives, which added an entirely new dimension to whatever conspiracy Sarah had stumbled into. This was no longer just about money laundering. This was potentially about espionage or international terrorism. Sarah moved quickly to a new position, using the parked cars as cover while she tried to get a visual on her pursuers. Through the gaps between vehicles, she could see three men moving through the garage with professional precision. They were dressed in dark suits similar to the one worn by the man she had disarmed, and they were carrying what appeared to be suppressed handguns. The use of suppressed weapons in an airport parking garage suggested that these operatives were prepared to kill her if necessary, but they wanted to do it quietly to avoid attracting attention from airport security. That gave Sarah a tactical advantage. If she could force them into a situation where they had to make noise, they would lose the element of stealth that they were counting on. Sarah moved silently between the parked cars, working her way toward the stairwell that led back into the terminal. If she could reach the stairwell, she would have multiple escape routes and access to areas with security cameras and civilian witnesses. The operatives would be much less likely to try anything violent in a crowded public space. But as she approached the stairwell, Sarah realized that the operatives had anticipated her strategy. One of them had positioned himself near the exit, effectively cutting off her escape route. She was trapped between three armed men in a dimly lit parking garage, with no backup and no easy way out. Time to get creative. Sarah spotted a fire alarm pull station mounted on a concrete pillar about 20 feet away. If she could reach it and trigger the alarm, the parking garage would be flooded with airport security within minutes. The downside was that she would have to cross open ground to reach the alarm, exposing herself to hostile fire. She took a deep breath and made her move. Using a parked SUV as cover, Sarah sprinted toward the fire alarm, staying low and moving in an unpredictable pattern to make herself a difficult target. The operatives reacted immediately. She heard suppressed gunshots behind her, followed by the sound of bullets striking concrete and metal. One shot shattered the rear window of a car she had just passed, showering her with safety glass. Sarah reached the fire alarm and yanked the pull station. Immediately, loud sirens began wailing throughout the parking garage, and emergency lights started flashing. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and Sarah could see the operatives covering their ears as they tried to maintain their pursuit. The alarm had the desired effect. Within seconds, Sarah could hear airport security personnel responding to the emergency, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The operatives would now have to choose between continuing their pursuit and risking exposure, or breaking off and trying to escape before law enforcement arrived in force. But Sarah wasn't content to simply wait for rescue. She had disabled one threat and triggered an alarm, but three dangerous operatives were still loose in a public space, and there was no telling what they might do if they felt cornered. She needed to neutralize the remaining threats before innocent civilians got hurt. Moving quickly while the operatives were still disoriented by the alarm, Sarah worked her way around behind them, using the flashing emergency lights and the chaos of the alarm to mask her movement. She could see that the three men were trying to coordinate their escape, communicating through hand signals while keeping their weapons ready. The closest operative was a tall, thin man with a scar running down the left side of his face. He was positioned behind a concrete pillar, scanning the area where Sarah had been when she triggered the alarm. He clearly hadn't realized that she had moved, which gave her the element of surprise she needed. Sarah approached from his blind spot, moving with the silent precision that had made her one of the most effective special operations commanders in the military. When she was within arm's reach, she struck. The takedown was swift and efficient. Sarah disabled the operative's weapon arm with a targeted strike to a pressure point, then applied a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious within seconds. She relieved him of his weapon and his radio, then dragged his unconscious form behind a car where he wouldn't be immediately visible to his partners. 2 down, 2 to go. The remaining operatives had realized that their partner was down, and they were now moving more cautiously, back to back, covering each other as they tried to locate Sarah's new position. These two were clearly the most experienced of the group, and they weren't going to be as easy to surprise. Sarah could hear airport security getting closer, their voices echoing through the stairwells as they responded to the fire alarm. She probably had less than 2 minutes before the parking garage would be crawling with law enforcement, which meant she needed to end this confrontation quickly. She decided to use the approaching security personnel to her advantage. Moving to a position where she could see both remaining operatives, Sarah called out in a loud, clear voice. "Federal agent, drop your weapons and get on the ground." It was a calculated risk. Sarah wasn't actually a federal agent, but in the chaos of the emergency alarm, with security personnel approaching from multiple directions, the operatives might not be sure who was shouting at them or how many law enforcement officers they were facing. The bluff worked partially. One of the operatives, a stocky man with a shaved head, immediately dropped his weapon and raised his hands. But the other, a bearded man who appeared to be the leader of the group, raised his gun and began scanning for a target. "Show yourself," he shouted back in accented English. "I know you are only one person." So much for the bluff. The bearded operative was too experienced to be fooled by Sarah's deception, and he was apparently willing to risk with what he believed to be a single federal agent. Sarah heard the sound of heavy boots coming up the stairwell. Airport security was almost here. She needed to end this now, before innocent security officers walked into a firefight. She made her decision. Instead of trying to hide or wait for backup, Sarah stepped out from behind cover, the suppressed pistol she had taken from the first operative held ready in a two-handed grip. "Last chance," she called out. "Drop the weapon." The bearded operative spun toward her voice and raised his gun, but Sarah was already moving. Years of training and combat experience had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge, and she was faster than her opponent by a crucial fraction of a second. The suppressed gunshot was barely audible over the wailing fire alarm, but the operative's weapon went spinning across the concrete floor as Sarah's bullet struck his gun hand. He dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded hand and cursing in what sounded like Russian. The stocky operative who had surrendered remained motionless with his hands raised, clearly unwilling to test Sarah's marksmanship after seeing what had happened to his partner. "Smart choice," Sarah told him, keeping her weapon trained on both men as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Airport security burst into the parking garage just as Sarah was securing the weapons that the operatives had dropped. The security officers were clearly expecting a fire emergency, not an armed confrontation, and they seemed confused by the scene that greeted them. "Federal agent," Sarah called out, deciding to maintain her cover story for the moment. "I have 2 suspects in custody and 1 wounded. We need medical attention and law enforcement backup." The lead security officer, a middle-aged man with the bearing of a retired police officer, took charge of the situation with professional competence. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." Sarah reached slowly into her jacket and pulled out her military credentials, which were close enough to federal law enforcement to satisfy the security officer's immediate concerns. She would deal with the jurisdictional complications later. As the security team secured the 2 conscious operatives and called for medical assistance for the wounded one, Sarah found herself thinking about the larger implications of what had just happened. Had moved incredibly quickly to put surveillance on her, and he had access to professional operatives who were willing to engage in armed confrontation in a public place. That level of resources and commitment suggested that whatever was involved in was much more serious than simple financial fraud. Her phone buzzed with another encrypted message from Lieutenant Colonel. "Update. Industries just received a wire transfer of $50 million from an account linked to known terrorist financiers. Whatever you did to get their attention, they're taking it very seriously. Where are you?" Sarah looked around at the chaos in the parking garage, security officers, paramedics treating the wounded operative, police cars arriving with flashing lights, and realized that her quiet trip home for her brother's graduation had just become something much more complicated. She typed back, "Dulles Airport, we have a problem, just tried to have me killed." The response came back immediately. "Stay exactly where you are. I'm sending a team to extract you. Do not trust local law enforcement until we can verify their security clearance." Sarah pocketed her phone and looked around at the arriving police officers. If was right about not trusting local law enforcement, then she was potentially surrounded by people who might be compromised by whatever organization was working for. The wounded operative was being loaded into an ambulance, and the other 2 were being placed in the back of police cars. But Sarah had no way of knowing if they would actually make it to a secure detention facility or if they would simply disappear into the same network that had produced them. She needed to get out of there, and she needed to do it before anyone realized that she wasn't actually a federal agent authorized to operate on domestic soil. As the lead security officer approached her with a clipboard full of paperwork, Sarah made her decision. "Officer, I need to make a secure phone call to my superiors. Can you give me a few minutes of privacy?" "Of course, Agent." The officer looked at her credentials again. "Martinez, take all the time you need." Sarah walked toward the stairwell, ostensibly to make her phone call, but actually to position herself near an exit route. If extraction team was coming to get her, she needed to be ready to move quickly. And if anyone tried to stop her from leaving, she needed to be prepared for another confrontation. As she reached the stairwell, Sarah heard one of the police officers speaking into his radio. "Yeah, we've got the suspects in custody, but there's something weird about this federal agent. Her credentials look legitimate, but there's no record of any federal operation at Dulles today." Time to go. Sarah slipped into the stairwell and began moving quickly toward the terminal. Behind her, she could hear the police officers realizing that their federal agent had just disappeared, followed by urgent radio communications as they tried to figure out what was happening. She had maybe 5 minutes before every law enforcement officer in the airport would be looking for her. Extraction team better be fast, because Sarah was rapidly running out of places to hide. Sarah moved through the busy terminal with practiced anonymity, blending in with the crowds of travelers while keeping one eye on the security cameras and another on potential escape routes. Her military training had included extensive instruction in urban evasion techniques, but she had never expected to use those skills in an American airport while fleeing from law enforcement who didn't know they were potentially compromised. Her encrypted phone buzzed with a location from extraction team. "Food court, level 3, table near the..." "Look for man in blue windbreaker reading Wall Street Journal." Sarah made her way to the indicated location, taking a circuitous route that allowed her to check for surveillance while appearing to be just another traveler looking for somewhere to eat. The food court was crowded with people, which provided excellent cover, but also made it difficult to identify potential threats in the crowd. She spotted her contact immediately, a man in his 30s with close-cropped hair and the kind of alert posture that screamed military or intelligence background. He was indeed reading the Wall Street Journal, but his eyes were constantly scanning the crowd around him, looking for threats or Sarah herself. Sarah approached his table and sat down across from him without invitation. "Nice day for traveling," she said, using the recognition phrase had texted her. "Could be better," the man replied with the correct response. "Dave sends his regards. I'm Agent, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to get you out of here before airport security figures out that you're not actually a federal agent with jurisdiction in Virginia." "How much time do we have?" Sarah asked, already standing up. "Maybe 10 minutes before they start checking security footage and realize you left the parking garage," replied, folding his newspaper. "There's a service corridor that leads to the employee parking area. We have a car waiting." As they walked toward the service corridor, filled Sarah in on what team had discovered about Industries while she had been fighting for her life in the parking garage. "The $50 million transfer was just the tip of the iceberg," explained quietly as they walked. "Our financial analysts have been tracing money flows for the past 6 hours, and it's looking like they're the American front for a much larger international operation. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars being funneled through defense contracts to fund terrorist activities across 3 continents. Sarah felt a chill as the full scope of what she had stumbled into became clear. How long has this been going on? At least 5 years, maybe longer. Industries has been using their legitimate defense contracts as cover to move money and equipment to terrorist organizations in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. They're not just contractors. They're arms dealers and terrorist financiers operating under the protection of the United States government. They reached the service corridor and led Sarah through a maze of employee-only areas toward a loading dock that connected to the employee parking area. The corridors were empty except for occasional airport workers who paid no attention to 2 people who looked like they belonged there. "But here's the really disturbing part," continued as they walked. "Industries has been providing logistics support for some of your operations, Sarah. Remember that mission in Afghanistan 18 months ago where your team had to extract those CIA assets from Kabul?" Sarah nodded. It had been one of the most dangerous missions of her career, a nighttime helicopter insertion into Taliban-controlled territory to rescue two intelligence officers whose cover had been blown. Industries provided the fuel for your helicopters and the encrypted communications equipment for that mission, which means they had detailed intelligence about your team's capabilities, your tactics, and your operational schedule. The implications of what was telling her were staggering. They've been using intelligence from our operations to help the people we're fighting against. That's our working theory. We think has been selling operational intelligence to terrorist organizations, helping them anticipate and counter American special operations missions. How many of your missions in the past 2 years involved unexpected complications or intelligence failures? Sarah thought back over her recent deployments, and a sick feeling grew in her stomach. There had been several missions where enemy forces had seemed unusually well prepared for their tactics, where ambushes had been waiting in exactly the right locations, where targets had been moved just hours before planned raids. "Jesus," she whispered, "how many people died because of intelligence leaks?" "We don't know yet," replied grimly. "But we're going to find out. The counterintelligence investigation is now classified at the highest levels, and every mission that involved industry's support is being reviewed for potential intelligence compromises." They reached the loading dock, where a nondescript sedan was waiting with its engine running. As they approached the car, Sarah's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Don't answer it," warned, but Sarah was already looking at the caller ID. "It's," she said, "Richard is calling me directly." Considered this for a moment. "Answer it, but keep him talking. Our technical team can try to trace the call and maybe get some useful intelligence." Sarah answered the phone. "Mister, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." His voice came through clearly, but there was none of the arrogant bluster she had heard at the airport checkpoint. He sounded calm, professional, and much more dangerous than he had appeared to be in his expensive suit. "Captain Martinez, I think we got off on the wrong foot this morning. I'd like to apologize for any misunderstanding and perhaps discuss how we can resolve this situation amicably." "I'm listening," Sarah said, gesturing to start recording the call. "I understand that you've been making inquiries about my company, and that some of my security personnel may have overreacted to your presence at the airport. I want you to know that was not authorized by me, and I've taken steps to ensure it won't happen again." Sarah almost laughed at the blatant lie. "Your security personnel tried to kill me, mister. That seems like a pretty significant overreaction." "I'm told there was a misunderstanding, and that shots were fired accidentally during what should have been a simple surveillance operation. No one was supposed to get hurt. One of your people is in the hospital with a gunshot wound to the hand. I'd say someone definitely got hurt." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. "Captain, I think you may have misunderstood the nature of my business. Industries is a legitimate defense contractor that has served the United States military faithfully for years. We have no interest in harming American service members." "Then why did you put armed surveillance on me within hours of our encounter at the checkpoint?" Another pause. "Captain, I'm going to be very direct with you. You have information that could be damaging to legitimate business operations and to ongoing military missions that depend on my company's support. I'm prepared to offer you substantial compensation in exchange for your discretion regarding what you think you may have discovered." Sarah looked at, who was gesturing for her to keep talking while his technical team worked on tracing the call. "What kind of compensation are we talking about?" Sarah asked. $5 million, transferred to any account you specify, in exchange for your agreement to cease any investigation into industries, and to refrain from sharing any information you may have gathered with military or intelligence personnel." The offer was so blatant, so obviously an admission of guilt, that Sarah almost couldn't believe had made it. But it also told her something important about how desperate he was becoming. "That's a generous offer, mister, but I'm curious, why is my silence worth $5 million to you?" "Let's just say that my business operations are complex and involve sensitive relationships with international partners. Misunderstandings about the nature of those relationships could be costly for everyone involved, including the United States military. Captain, I'm going to ask you one more time to consider my offer. $5 million is a life-changing amount of money, and all you have to do is walk away from something that doesn't really concern you. Sarah made her decision. Mister, I have a counteroffer for you. Surrender yourself to federal authorities, cooperate fully with the investigation into your company's activities, and maybe the prosecutors will consider a plea agreement that doesn't involve the death penalty for treason. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was any pretense of civility or business-like negotiation. Captain Martinez, you have no idea what you're interfering with. My associates and I have invested too much time and money in our operations to allow one self-righteous soldier to destroy everything we've built. If you continue to pursue this investigation, you will discover that there are consequences for people who threaten our business interests. Is that a threat, mister? It's a promise. You may have been lucky today, but you can't protect yourself forever, and you certainly can't protect your family forever. Sarah felt a surge of cold anger at the mention of her family. What did you say? Your brother Tommy is graduating from Georgetown tomorrow, isn't he? Summa cum in international relations, accepted to law school. You must be very proud of him. It would be a shame if something happened to him because of your stubbornness. The threat against Tommy was the final straw. Sarah's voice became deadly calm. Mister, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. If you or anyone associated with you goes anywhere near my brother, I will hunt you down and kill you personally. Do you understand me? Captain, you're in no position to make threats. You're being hunted by law enforcement, your military career is over, and your family is now at risk because of your actions. The smart thing to do would be to take my money and disappear. The smart thing for you to do would be to run as far and as fast as you can, because I'm coming for you, Sarah replied. And when I find you, you're going to wish you had never heard my name. She hung up the phone and turned to. Please tell me your technical team got something useful from that call. They got a location, replied with satisfaction. Was calling from a secure facility in Northern Virginia, about 30 miles from here. We've got teams moving to surround the location now. I want to be there when you take him down, Sarah said. Sarah, I understand your anger, but you're not law enforcement. This needs to be handled by professionals who have jurisdiction and proper legal authority. With all due respect, Agent, this son of a bitch just threatened my brother and admitted to selling intelligence that got American soldiers killed. I'm not sitting on the sidelines while someone else handles this. Considered this for a moment. Okay, but you're coming as a military liaison, not as a vigilante. We do this by the book with proper backup and legal authorization. Deal. Deal, Sarah agreed, though she had her own ideas about what would happen when she finally came face to face with Richard. As they drove toward the industry's facility, Sarah called her brother Tommy to warn him about the potential threat. The conversation was difficult. She couldn't tell him the full details of what was happening, but she needed him to understand that he might be in danger because of her investigation. Sis, what's going on? Tommy asked after she had given him a carefully edited version of recent events. This doesn't sound like your normal military stuff. It's complicated, Tommy. Just promise me you'll stay on campus until I can get some protective detail assigned to you. Don't go anywhere alone, and if anyone approaches you claiming to represent me or my unit, call me immediately. You're scaring me, Sarah. Are you in danger? Sarah looked out the window at the Virginia countryside, rushing past as drove toward what would likely be a major confrontation with an international terrorist financing operation. I'm fine, Tommy, but I need you to be careful until this is over. Can you do that for me? Of course, but Sarah, promise me you'll be careful too. I can't lose my big sister right before graduation. You won't lose me, Sarah promised, though she had no idea what they would find when they reached the industry's facility. I'll see you at graduation tomorrow, okay? Okay, I love you, sis. I love you too. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that tomorrow was no longer guaranteed. If Industries was as dangerous and well-connected as the intelligence suggested, the next few hours could determine whether she would live to see her brother graduate, and whether she would be able to prevent a terrorist financing operation from continuing to funnel money and intelligence to America's enemies. Its radio crackled with updates from the teams that were moving to surround the facility. Alpha team in position. Bravo team moving to rear approach. Target building is a converted warehouse with multiple vehicles in the parking area. Looks like they're still operational. Copy that, replied. Charlie Team, what's your status? Charlie Team is encountering some complications. We've got what looks like professional security around the perimeter, and they appear to be armed. This isn't just a corporate office building. It's set up like a fortress. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. If had fortified his facility and stationed armed guards around it, he was clearly prepared for some kind of confrontation. The question was whether he was planning to surrender peacefully or whether he intended to fight his way out. All teams be advised that we may be dealing with foreign operatives, transmitted. Exercise extreme caution and remember that these suspects are considered highly dangerous. As they approached the industry's facility, Sarah could see that it was indeed set up more like a military compound than a corporate office. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded a cluster of warehouse-style buildings, and she could see armed guards patrolling the perimeter. This doesn't look like a logistics company, Sarah observed. No, it doesn't, agreed. It looks like a terrorist training facility operating on American soil. The radio crackled again. All teams, we've got movement inside the compound. Multiple vehicles starting up, and it looks like they're preparing to evacuate. Do we have authority to move in? Looked at Sarah. This is it. Once we go in there, there's no going back. Are you ready for this? Sarah checked the pistol she had taken from operative in the parking garage and made sure she had a full magazine. I've been ready since that bastard threatened my brother. All teams, this is Control. You are authorized to move in. Remember, we want Richard alive if possible, but protect yourselves and prevent anyone from escaping. As the tactical teams moved in on the compound, Sarah realized that she was about to confront not just Richard, but potentially an entire network of terrorists and traitors who had been operating under the cover of legitimate business for years. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure would mean that the people responsible for selling American military secrets and funding terrorist attacks would disappear into the international underworld, free to continue their deadly work. The assault on the industry's compound began at exactly 4:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Sarah watched from the tactical command vehicle as 3 teams of federal agents and military specialists moved in coordinated formation toward the fortified warehouse complex. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Virginia countryside, and the peaceful rural setting seemed completely at odds with the high-stakes counterterrorism operation that was about to unfold. Alpha Team breaching the main entrance, came the radio transmission. Multiple hostiles armed and resistant. The sound of gunfire erupted from the compound almost immediately. Sarah could see muzzle flashes through the windows of the main warehouse building, and she realized that people were indeed prepared to fight rather than surrender quietly. Bravo Team, we've got vehicles attempting to escape through the rear gate, another voice reported. 3 SUVs, heavily tinted windows, moving at high speed toward the secondary access road. Was coordinating the tactical response from the command vehicle, but Sarah could see that the situation was becoming more complex by the minute. This wasn't just a simple arrest operation. It was turning into a full-scale battle with what appeared to be a well-armed and well-organized group of international operatives. Charlie Team, can you intercept those vehicles? Transmitted. Negative, Control. The vehicles are armored and they're not stopping for roadblocks. We need air support if you want to prevent their escape. Sarah grabbed Sarm. I need to get in there. If escapes in one of those vehicles, we may never get another chance to bring him to justice. Shook his head. Absolutely not. You're a liaison, not an assault team member. Let the professionals handle this. But Sarah was already putting on a tactical vest and checking her weapon. Agent, with all due respect, I've been conducting high-risk operations like this for 3 years. I know what I'm doing, and I have a personal stake in making sure that doesn't get away. Before could stop her, Sarah was out of the command vehicle and running toward the compound. She could hear him shouting orders over the radio for someone to stop her, but she was already committed to her course of action. The main gate had been blown open by the Alpha Team, and Sarah could see federal agents moving through the compound in tactical formation, clearing buildings and neutralizing armed resistance. The sound of automatic weapons fire was constant now, echoing off the warehouse buildings and creating a chaotic symphony of violence. Sarah made her way toward the rear of the compound, where the escaping vehicles had last been seen. If was trying to escape, he would likely be in one of those SUVs, and she was determined to intercept him before he could disappear into whatever network had been protecting his operation. As she rounded the corner of the main warehouse, Sarah came face to face with two armed operatives who were apparently providing rear-guard security for the escaping vehicles. The operatives were dressed in military-style tactical gear, and their weapons and equipment looked expensive and professional. The first operative raised his assault rifle, but Sarah was already moving. Her training in close-quarters combat had taught her to eliminate threats quickly and efficiently, and she put 2 rounds center mass into the first target before he could fire a shot. The second operative tried to take cover behind a concrete barrier, but Sarah flanked him and disarmed him with a combination of speed and tactical surprise that left him unconscious on the ground within seconds. She could see the 3 escaping SUVs about 200 yards away, racing toward a gap in the fence that led to a secondary road. One of the vehicles had already made it through the gap, but the other 2 were still within the compound perimeter. Sarah commandeered an abandoned motorcycle that one of the operatives had apparently been planning to use for escape. The motorcycle was a high-performance sport bike, perfect for pursuit in rough terrain, and Sarah had extensive experience with similar vehicles from her special operations training. The motorcycle roared to life, and Sarah accelerated toward the escaping SUVs, weaving between concrete barriers and abandoned equipment as she closed the distance. The second SUV made it through the gap in the fence just as Sarah reached the perimeter, but the third vehicle was still struggling to navigate around some debris that had been left in its path. Through the rear window of the third SUV, Sarah could see Richard himself, his face contorted with anger and fear as he shouted orders at the driver. This was her chance. Sarah pulled alongside the SUV and drew her sidearm, aiming for the front tire. The shot was difficult. She was traveling at high speed on a motorcycle while trying to hit a moving target, but her marksmanship training paid off. The SUV's front tire exploded, sending the vehicle into a skidding spin that ended with it crashing into a concrete drainage ditch. Sarah brought the motorcycle to a stop and approached the crashed SUV with her weapon drawn. The driver was unconscious, probably from the impact, but was moving in the back seat, apparently trying to free himself from his. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands visible," Sarah commanded, keeping her pistol trained on. Looked up at her through the shattered rear window, and for the first time since she had met him, his arrogant facade was completely gone. He looked like what he really was, a frightened criminal who had been caught and was facing the consequences of his actions. "Captain Martinez," he said, his voice shaky, "I think we can still work something out. I have information that could be valuable to your government, intelligence about terrorist operations that your people don't know about." "The only thing I want to hear from you is a confession," Sarah replied. "Get out of the car now." Moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. As he stood beside the wrecked SUV, Sarah could see that he was injured. There was blood on his forehead from the crash, and he was favoring his left leg. "Captain, you have to understand, everything I did was for the greater good. The intelligence I provided to certain organizations helped prevent larger conflicts, helped maintain stability in regions where American interests were at stake." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of what she was hearing. "You sold American military secrets to terrorists, mister. You helped them plan attacks on American soldiers. How exactly is that for the greater good?" "The world is more complicated than you realize," said desperately. "Sometimes you have to work with unsavory people to prevent larger catastrophes. The money I moved, the information I shared, it was all part of a larger strategy to maintain balance in unstable regions." "Balance," Sarah repeated. "Is that what you call it when American soldiers die because you told their enemies where they would be and how they would attack?" His face crumpled. Those deaths were unintended consequences, collateral damage in a larger strategic operation. "Collateral damage," Sarah said, her voice growing cold. "Tell that to the families of the soldiers who died because of your betrayal. Tell that to the children who lost their fathers because you sold intelligence to the highest bidder." She could hear vehicles approaching. Backup from the federal task force was arriving to secure the scene. But Sarah wasn't done with yet. "There's something I need you to understand, mister. When you threatened my brother, when you suggested that innocent people might be hurt because of my investigation, you crossed a line that you can never uncross." "Captain, please, I was desperate. I would never actually hurt your family. That was just..." That was just a negotiating tactic. A negotiating tactic, Sarah said. Just like selling intelligence was a strategic operation and getting soldiers killed was collateral damage. You have an excuse for everything, don't you? Federal agents were surrounding the crash site now, their weapons drawn and their voices calling for both Sarah and to identify themselves. Sarah holstered her weapon and raised her hands to show that she was not a threat. Federal agent, this is Captain Martinez. I have Richard in custody. He's injured but conscious and talking. His voice came over the radio immediately. Sarah, are you hurt? I'm fine, but I need you to make sure that gets full medical attention before he's interrogated. I want him healthy enough to stand trial for treason. As the federal agents took custody of, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion wash over her. The man who had threatened her family and betrayed American soldiers was finally in custody, but the larger investigation was far from over. The financial networks that had supported its operation would take months or years to unravel completely. Agent approached her as the paramedics loaded into an ambulance. Sarah, that was incredibly reckless. You could have been killed charging in there alone. But I wasn't, Sarah replied, and didn't escape. Sometimes reckless is exactly what the situation requires. Shook his head, but Sarah could see that he was impressed despite his professional disapproval of her tactics. The preliminary count from the compound is 12 arrested operatives, 3 injured, and enough evidence to keep prosecutors busy for the next 5 years. We found financial records, weapons shipments, communications with known terrorist organizations, and detailed intelligence files on American military operations. What about the other vehicles that escaped? We've got APBs out on them, and the FBI is coordinating with international partners to track down the other members of the network. This is just the beginning, Sarah. What you stumbled onto at that checkpoint is going to lead to the dismantling of one of the largest terrorist financing operations ever discovered on American soil. Over the next several hours, as Sarah gave her statement to federal investigators and helped them understand the intelligence implications of what they had discovered, she began to realize the full scope of what had been accomplished. The chance encounter with an arrogant businessman at a German checkpoint had led to the exposure of a network that had been responsible for funding terrorist attacks and selling American military secrets for years. The next morning, Sarah found herself standing in the audience at Georgetown University, watching her brother Tommy walk across the stage to receive his diploma. After everything that had happened in the past 24 hours, the simple ceremony felt surreal and profoundly moving. Tommy had no idea what his sister had been through to be there. As far as he knew, she had taken a few extra days of leave to attend his graduation, and Sarah intended to keep it that way. Some stories were too dangerous and too classified to share, even with family. But as Tommy's name was called and he stepped forward to receive his diploma, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond pride in her brother's academic achievement. She had kept her promise to be there for this important moment, despite everything that Richard and his associates had tried to do to stop her. After the ceremony, Tommy found Sarah in the crowd of families and graduates. "Sis, I can't believe you made it. I thought you might be stuck overseas for another few weeks." Sarah hugged her brother tightly, thinking about how close she had come to missing this moment, and how close Tommy had come to being hurt because of her investigation. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," she said. "I'm so proud of you, Tommy. Law school is going to be lucky to have you." "Thanks, sis, but what about you? Are you okay? You look exhausted." Sarah smiled. "Just a long flight from Germany, but I'm exactly where I want to be." As they walked across the campus with the other graduates and their families, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Agent. "Is cooperating fully with the investigation. The intelligence he's providing is leading to arrests of terrorist financiers on 3 continents. The operation you helped uncover is being called one of the most significant counterterrorism successes in recent years. Well done, Captain." Sarah pocketed her phone without responding. The praise from federal law enforcement was appreciated, but the real reward was being able to walk across a college campus with her brother, knowing that she had helped stop people who would have used their profits to fund attacks on innocent civilians. "So what's next for you?" Tommy asked as they made their way toward the restaurant where they were meeting other family members for a celebration dinner. Sarah thought about the question. Her leave was supposed to last another week, but she knew that the investigation would probably require her testimony and continued cooperation for months to come. There would be trials, congressional hearings, and extensive debriefings about the intelligence failures that had allowed the network to operate for so long. But there would also be time to heal, time to reconnect with family and friends, and time to decide what came next in her military career. The events of the past day had reminded her why she served, but they had also shown her that there were threats to American security that went beyond traditional military operations. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but I think I might be interested in working more closely with the intelligence community. There are threats out there that require a different kind of response than what traditional special operations can provide." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "Well, whatever you decide to do, I know you'll be great at it. You always are." As they entered the restaurant where their extended family was waiting to celebrate Tommy's graduation, Sarah reflected on how a simple act of standing up to a bully at an airport checkpoint had led to one of the most important counterterrorism operations of her career. Sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the most important battles were the ones you never planned to fight. But when the moment came to choose between looking the other way and standing up for what was right, Sarah was glad she had chosen to fight. The investigation into Industries would continue for months, eventually leading to the prosecution of over 50 individuals involved in terrorist financing and the seizure of hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit funds. The intelligence gathered from the operation would help prevent numerous terrorist attacks and save countless lives. But for Sarah Martinez, the most important outcome was much simpler. She had kept a promise to her brother, protected innocent people from harm, and proven that sometimes one person standing up to injustice could change everything. As the family celebration continued around her, Sarah allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight was for family, for celebration, and for the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you did the right thing when it mattered most. The arrogant businessman who had pushed past her at a checkpoint would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and the network of terrorists and traitors he had supported would no longer threaten American soldiers or innocent civilians. It wasn't perfect justice. Some of the network members had escaped, and some of the damage they had caused could never be fully repaired. But it was enough. Sarah had learned long ago that perfect justice was rare in the real world, and that sometimes you had to be satisfied with preventing future harm and holding the guilty accountable for their actions. As she raised her glass to toast her brother's achievement, Sarah silently made another promise: to continue fighting for justice, wherever it might lead her, and to never back down when innocent people were threatened by those who believed their wealth and power made them untouchable. The fight against terrorism and injustice would continue, but tonight was for celebration, for family, and for the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories came from the most unexpected encounters with evil.